It was a Thursday evening in December 2016 when a Dalit teenage schoolgirl, born in 1999, left home in Tamil Nadu's Aryallur district, nestled in the quiet village of Sirukadambur around 8 p.m., telling her elder sister she was stepping out for a short while. That was the last time her family saw her alive. 2 weeks later, her body was discovered in a village well. Her hands were tied, her clothing was missing. Her mother, Rajkili, said she had injuries and that her daughter's earrings and anklets were gone. What began as a missing person report quickly turned into something far more serious. The case shook the region. Because what followed wasn't just about a tragic death. It became a story about caste, power, contradictions in evidence, and a justice system many say failed to deliver. This is not a dramatization. This is the real story of what happened in Aryallur and why it still matters. In the rural village of Sirukadambur, located in Tamil Nadu's Aryallur district, lived a teenage girl named Nandini, born in 1999. She belonged to the Parayar community, listed among India's scheduled castes, groups historically placed at the bottom of the social hierarchy. They were labeled as untouchables and called Dalits, which means broken and oppressed. In traditional caste hierarchies, Dalits were considered impure and assigned the most dehumanizing and stigmatized forms of labor, such as cleaning latrines, disposing of dead animals, or manual scavenging. In India, caste is a centuries-old system that divides people into rigid social groups based on their birth, family background, and traditional occupations. It began in ancient Hindu scriptures and, over time, evolved into a deeply entrenched hierarchy. Welcome to the Crime Series. I am glad to have you join us on another video. Kindly subscribe, like, and share. Let me know where you are watching from. The caste system is broadly made up of 4 main categories, known as Varnas. Number 1 is the Brahmins. This group includes the priests, scholars, and teachers. Number 2 is the Kshatriyas. This group includes the warriors and rulers. Number 3 are the Vaishyas. These are the traders and merchants. Number 4 are the Shudras. These are the laborers and service workers. But outside of these 4 groups are the Dalits, once labeled as untouchables. For generations, they've been subjected to discrimination, violence, and social exclusion simply because of their caste. Even though caste-based discrimination is now illegal under Indian law, it continues to influence everyday life, especially in rural areas. From marriage and education to jobs and politics, caste still plays a powerful role in shaping opportunity and, in many cases, injustice. Marriages across caste lines, especially involving Dalits, were often violently opposed. Though India outlawed untouchability over 7 decades ago, caste-based barriers still persist, especially in rural villages like Sirukadambur. Dalit families often live on the outskirts, and their children grow up with an awareness of the invisible line they are never supposed to cross. Nandini's family experienced this reality firsthand. She lived with her mother, Rajkili, and 3 siblings in a modest home surrounded by neighbors from dominant caste backgrounds. To support the household, Rajkili worked as a daily wage laborer, primarily in construction, hauling cement, lifting bricks, and doing strenuous manual labor for a few hundred rupees a day. It was physically exhausting work, but she did it to keep her children in school and food on the table, as there was no father in the picture, and the burden fell squarely on her. Nandini grew up knowing what survival looked like. For her, daily life was a balance between helping her family and seeking dignity in a deeply divided society. She had been enrolled in school up to the 8th standard, but had to drop out to support the household financially. She began accompanying her mother to work, carrying bricks, mixing cement, and doing whatever it took, not just to support the family, but also to stay close to her mother, who feared for her safety. In rural areas, Dalit girls are disproportionately at risk of harassment and violence, making visibility and supervision a constant concern. Despite the hardship, those close to her described her as quiet, obedient, and focused on the small ambitions she held, perhaps one day returning to school, perhaps gaining a better life. It was at one of these work sites that Nandini met Manikandan, a 26-year-old supervisor who belonged to a dominant caste. He had status, not just due to his caste, but also because he was affiliated with a local right-wing religious outfit in the rigid social setup of the village that made him influential. Their interactions started with brief conversations, but it wasn't long before Nandini found herself drawn in, and eventually, their friendship turned into a relationship, but it wasn't a relationship of equals. The relationship between Nandini and Manikandan lasted for nearly a year. People around them noticed, because they weren't discreet enough, as neighbors often saw Manikandan when he dropped Nandini home late at night after work, and other villagers remembered seeing her waiting near the Dalit toilet outhouse, a location the couple felt was discreet enough for brief, hushed conversations away from prying eyes. On the days they didn't meet, Nandini, who didn't own a phone, would borrow one from her girlfriends who were better off both socially and economically to speak to Manikandan. This made their communication more frequent. For Nandini, this may have felt like trust, affection, a chance at something more than the routine her life had offered so far. But over time, things began to shift. Caste has a way of dictating boundaries, especially for young women like Nandini. As the relationship progressed, so did the pressure. Nandini found out she was pregnant. To save face, she wanted Manikandan to do right by her, but he refused, and this was where the trouble began. He had allegedly told her it wasn't possible, not because of who she was, but because of what caste she came from. He pressured her to end the pregnancy. The promise of something real faded fast. What Nandini wanted was stability. What she got was silence and distance. The relationship was strained. Nandini stopped talking about it at home. She knew it wouldn't take long for her mother and sisters to find out about the pregnancy, so she became withdrawn, unsettled. Those close to her sensed that something was wrong, but no one knew what the real issue was or imagined what would happen next. On the evening of December 29, 2016, Nandini left her home in Sirukadambur village around 8 p.m. She told her sister she'd be back soon. But by 9 p.m., when she hadn't returned, concern turned into alarm. Her mother Rajakili, along with her elder sister Sivarajini and uncle, began searching for her. When their search yielded nothing, they went straight to the Irumbuli Kurichi police station to report her missing. There, they were met with resistance. The family had written a complaint, clearly stating that Nandini may have been taken without consent, but the police refused to accept it that night. Officers reportedly asked them why they had come so late and if they didn't have anything better to do. The tone was dismissive. The officers spoke rudely and refused to take any action. After pleading with them and still receiving no help, the family returned home, empty-handed. They came back the next morning, on December 30th, and the complaint was finally accepted. But that was only the beginning of their struggle. Despite submitting a formal complaint, no immediate action was taken. Day after day, the family returned to the station, sometimes multiple times a day, begging for the police to search for Nandini. Her mother repeatedly told officers that Nandini had not run away, that she believed her daughter was in danger, that she wanted her found, alive. The family's written complaint had explicitly mentioned kidnapping, citing that Nandini was 1 year below the age of legal majority. According to Section 361 of the Indian Penal Code, taking a minor away without the guardian's consent is legally considered abduction. But police downgraded the complaint to a missing persons report, dismissing their claims. Instead of investigating, the police accused the family of exaggerating. Officers allegedly told them Nandini had likely eloped and would return on her own. Every time they showed up, they were insulted or brushed off. Rajakili begged the police to help find her daughter, but got no meaningful response. The family also provided critical leads. They informed officers about Nandini's relationship with Manikandan, a man from a dominant caste and a local construction supervisor. They told the police about her pregnancy, a fact revealed by Nandini's friend, Devi. They even submitted Manikandan's mobile number, asking that it be tracked. Still, nothing was done. It wasn't until January 3, 2017, nearly a week after the complaint was filed and after the family specifically named Manikandan, that a formal First Information Report, FIR, was registered. Only then did police summon Manikandan for questioning. On January 5th, he was called in by the Irumbuli Kurichi police, but despite hours of questioning, he was allowed to leave the same day. 2 individuals from his village reportedly signed as witnesses on his behalf, and he was released. The family strongly believes political influence played a role in this decision. Manikandan was associated with Hindu Manani, and the family accused the group's district organizer of using clout to interfere with the investigation. The next day, Manikandan vanished. He had gone into hiding. On January 9th, police began interrogating Manikandan's friends. Then on January 12th, Manikandan was found in a cashew forest near Kodakkur, having ingested poison in an apparent suicide attempt. He was taken to a local hospital. At Kuvagam police station, a case was registered. During questioning, Manikandan admitted that he had attempted suicide because he was being connected to Nandini's death. On January 14th, he made an extrajudicial statement before the village administrative officer, where he confessed to killing Nandini because she refused to terminate the pregnancy. If you found this story compelling and appreciate the way we bring real-life cases to you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Your support helps us continue to uncover the truth and share these important stories. Like, share, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going. That same day, police found Nandini's body in a well in Kilmalagai village. She had been stripped of her clothing and jewelry, her hands were tied, and cloth had been stuffed in her mouth. Her body was in an advanced state of decomposition. Maggots were present, confirming that the body had been there for a considerable period. Her family was called in to identify her. They confirmed it was Nandini. A post-mortem was conducted at the Aryalur Government Hospital. The report confirmed that Nandini had been violated and killed. However, it made no mention of her pregnancy, a detail her family had repeatedly informed the authorities about. The police claimed that her death occurred shortly after her disappearance on December 29th, and that there had been no unlawful detention. But her family and several local activists challenged this narrative. Advocate Sasi Kumar, a local activist who organized a fact-finding committee, stated that Nandini had been seen alive with Manikandan as late as January 3rd. An elderly woman in Manikandan's village recalled seeing Nandini seated on the back of his motorcycle during light rain. She even stopped him and said, "You have a woman with you. Why not stop under a shed until the rain passes?" To which Manikandan allegedly replied, "I know what I'm doing. I've seen both rain and sunshine." For Nandini's family, that witness account was critical. It suggested that Nandini may have been alive for several days after her disappearance. They believe the police backdated her time of death to cover up their inaction. Adding to their suspicions, the family also believes that Nandini was not killed by Manikandan alone. Local reports and advocacy groups allege that Nandini was brutally assaulted by multiple individuals, including the Union Secretary Manikandan and 3 of his associates. They claim she was subjected to inhumane physical harm that resulted in severe internal injuries, which included pulling out the fetus from her womb after cutting her private area with a blade, which led to the loss of her unborn child. According to these allegations, her life ended due to excessive bleeding, and her body was then disposed of in the well. The Irumbuli Kurichi police's delay in responding and their initial refusal to act became central to the larger narrative. This was no longer just a case of violence. It was a story of systemic neglect. A story of how Dalit families seeking help are too often met not with protection, but with silence, blame, or worse, deliberate inaction. Nandini's case became a chilling example of what happens when caste, power, and gender intersect, and the institutions meant to protect simply don't. When Nandini's body was pulled from the well in Kilmalagai, it marked the end of a painful search for her family, but the beginning of a much bigger reckoning. As details of her death began to circulate, her hands bound, her clothes missing, her body in a decomposed state, public outrage ignited. The pain was no longer confined to a single village. Across social media, thousands began sharing her story. The hashtag #JusticeForNandini trended widely. People expressed shock, grief, and anger, not just at the crime itself, but at the way it had been handled. Delayed action, dismissive policing, a confession that only came after weeks of alleged inaction. Many saw Nandini's case not as an isolated event, but as a reflection of something deeper. The way caste and gender can dictate the value of a life in the eyes of the system. Prominent political figures began to respond. M.K. Stalin, president of the DMK, visited Nandini's village. Standing among grieving family members, he promised that his party would demand a CBCID investigation into the case, signaling a lack of faith in the local police handling. Actor Kamal Hassan also joined the chorus of voices calling for justice. In a public statement, he apologized for speaking up late, but made it clear that the silence around Nandini's case needed to end. Similarly, well-known music director G.V. Prakash Kumar used his platform to raise awareness, urging swift legal action and justice for the victim. Meanwhile, Chinadurai, the district secretary of the Bahujan Samaj Party, made a bold claim: "There is no doubt that the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, RSS, and the Hindu Munani are behind this." His accusation tapped into a broader concern that political affiliations and caste-based organizations were influencing law enforcement behavior and potentially the course of justice. Beyond the screens and statements, there were offline protests as well. Students, Dalit rights groups, women's organizations, and civil society members gathered in towns across Tamil Nadu. Placards bearing Nandini's name appeared in marches, candlelight vigils, and demonstrations. People called not just for punishment, but for structural change, for a system that doesn't wait 2 weeks to take a missing girl seriously. For a brief period, Nandini became a symbol of all the girls who go unheard, of all the families told to be quiet, and of every mother who walks into a police station and gets told to come back tomorrow. The demand was simple, but loud: justice for Nandini. In the days following Manikandan's confession and the discovery of Nandini's body, the investigation expanded. After months of mounting public pressure and repeated appeals from the victim's family, the Tamil Nadu police filed a charge sheet in the case. It named 6 individuals, including a minor and Manikandan Ramasamy, as primary accused in the abduction and murder of Nandini. All were residents of the same village or nearby areas. Most of the accused belonged to dominant caste backgrounds, reinforcing the community's long-standing social divide. The charges filed ranged from murder, criminal conspiracy, to outraging the modesty of a woman, among others under the Indian Penal Code and the Protection of Children from Sexual Offences (POCSO) Act. Manikandan, who had previously confessed in an extrajudicial statement to the village administrative officer, was detained under the Gundas Act and lodged in Trichy Central Prison. Among the accused was Selvakumar, who would later become the only one convicted in the case. Another was Arun Kumar, who would later come into public attention, not for the crime, but for the path he chose afterward, a political career. The arrests were a moment of partial relief for Nandini's family. But what followed in their village was anything but healing. The atmosphere in Sirikadambur changed. The family's home, modest and surrounded by neighbors from dominant caste communities, became a place of isolation. Rajakili and her children felt targeted. People who once exchanged greetings now kept their distance. In some cases, words weren't needed. The silence, the looks, and the avoidance were enough to send a message. You've gone too far. They were no longer just grieving. They were also navigating pressure. Pressure not to talk, not to push, not to name names. Reports from local activists and community organizations noted that witnesses were unwilling to come forward. Allegedly, some were intimidated, others influenced, and many simply chose silence. In cases involving caste and power, fear becomes a very real part of the story. Speaking up can carry consequences, not just social, but sometimes legal or physical. In villages like Sirukadambur, caste is not just a backdrop. It's part of the air people breathe. And for Dalit families, standing up against dominant caste networks can feel like standing alone. Nandini's family refused to be silent. They demanded action, pursued the legal process, and continued to tell their daughter's story. But in their own village, they were slowly being cut off. It was clear that the road ahead would not just be about securing convictions. It would be about surviving the weight of social isolation and trying to protect what was left of their dignity while institutions and neighbors looked the other way. And still, even in the midst of that isolation, the family pressed forward. They weren't just seeking punishment. They were seeking accountability from a system that had already failed them once. The trial began in a special court for crimes against women in Arialur. But from the start, there were concerns. Nandini's family and Dalit rights activists demanded that the case be transferred to the CBCID, the crime branch, Criminal Investigation Department. They argued that local police had mishandled critical early steps in the investigation, refusing to act on the family's initial complaint, delaying the FIR, and allegedly ignoring evidence that could have been pursued in the days immediately following her disappearance. They believed that only a specialized, higher-level agency could ensure a fair and impartial probe. And besides, barely a year after the incident, policemen who had initially handled the case had all been transferred. In their defense, the officer on duty said it was normal for police officers to be transferred every 3 years, but Nandini's family and the Dalit community believed there were deeper reasons. In 2019, the Madras High Court denied that request. The court ruled that there was no need to transfer the investigation, stating that the current handling by district police was sufficient. Inside the courtroom, the case continued, but it quickly became clear that the road to justice would not be simple. As the trial progressed, several issues began to surface. Inconsistencies emerged in witness testimonies. Statements recorded early in the investigation were later retracted or altered. At least one eyewitness account, which placed Nandini alive after December 29th, was not fully supported by the case timeline presented in court. The forensic evidence, so often a cornerstone in such cases, did not bring clarity. Biological samples, including clothing collected from the scene and body, were introduced as key pieces of evidence. But doubts were raised about how the evidence had been preserved and handled. The defense lawyers capitalized on these gaps, arguing that the evidence was either inconclusive or compromised. They claimed that their clients had been falsely implicated and that the prosecution had failed to establish a direct link between the accused and the crime. To Nandini's family, it felt like the case was slipping through cracks they had feared from the beginning. In the public eye, this was more than a trial. It was a test of whether a Dalit girl's life, her testimony, and her family's fight would be given the same weight as anyone else's. For the grieving mother sitting through court hearings, the fight wasn't just about one verdict. It was about holding a system accountable, one that had ignored her cries the night her daughter vanished and now seemed on the verge of forgetting again. After years of emotional toll, legal battles, and delayed justice, a verdict was finally delivered in the case of Nandini. In early 2024, the special court handling crimes against women in Arialur district issued its judgment. Of the 6 men arrested in connection with Nandini's death, only one, Selvakumar, was found guilty of murder. The court acquitted the other 5 accused, including Manikandan Ramasamy, the man who had once confessed to the crime. He had been detained under the Gundas Act following his extrajudicial statement, but that alone did not hold up in court. According to legal observers and reports from the News Minute, the prosecution was unable to establish clear, corroborative evidence that directly linked Manikandan and the others to the act of murder beyond reasonable doubt. The case had already been plagued by contradictions in forensic evidence, retracted witness statements, and procedural lapses from the early stages of investigation. These failures created cracks in the prosecution's narrative, cracks wide enough for most of the accused to walk free. But the court did hold Selvakumar responsible. Though details of how Selvakumar's individual role was proven remain limited in public records, his conviction indicates that the court found enough admissible evidence to link him to the act of murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. For Rajakili, Nandini's mother, the verdict was devastating. She had fought not just to bring her daughter's story to light, but to ensure that everyone involved was held accountable. After the court acquitted Manikandan and the others, she told reporters that the verdict had denied her family justice. To her, one conviction was not enough. Not when the silence of key witnesses and the erosion of crucial forensic evidence made the truth harder to prove. Not when her daughter's case had been neglected from the moment she disappeared. Not when the man who was once considered the prime suspect walked free. Her pain was echoed by activists across the state. They questioned how a case with a confession, a decomposed body recovered based on that confession, and documented delays in police response could result in only one conviction. Some argued that this outcome reflected broader issues within the justice system, a failure to protect victims from marginalized communities, and a pattern of impunity when caste, gender, and power intersect. The courtroom verdict may have ended the trial. But for Nandini's family and many who had followed the case, the verdict raised a different question. If this wasn't justice, then what is? After the verdict, Rajakili, Nandini's mother, returned home, not with peace, but with questions. She had sat through the hearings, revisited every detail of the night her daughter vanished, and relived the 2 weeks of silence that followed. She had watched as key evidence was challenged in court, as witnesses hesitated or retracted their words, and as the system slowly unraveled the case she thought was clear. Now, the man who her daughter had once trusted, Manikandan, the man whose confession had led to the discovery of her body, was no longer being held responsible. For Rajakili, the courtroom may have closed its doors, but her search for justice did not. She spoke to the media. Calm, composed, but direct. She said the police had failed her family, that the trial had failed her daughter, and that one life sentence, without full accountability for all who were involved, was not justice. Nandini's case didn't happen in isolation. It happened within a system that has, time and again, failed those who sit at its margins. The justice system works differently for the privileged. When the victim is poor, young, female, and Dalit, the burden of proof becomes almost impossible. Not because evidence doesn't exist, but because it's not preserved, it's not believed, or it's deliberately sidelined. The names may change, but the outcomes remain painfully familiar. In Tamil Nadu alone, similar cases involving caste violence have followed the same pattern: public outrage, political statements, brief media coverage, and then a quiet fade into unresolved files. For Nandini's family, the recognition of that pattern only deepens the loss. Her mother, Rajakili, has often spoken about how people treated their fight for justice as if it was unreasonable, inconvenient, or unnecessary. But for families like hers, justice is not a demand, it's a right. And yet, that right has too often become a privilege, available to some, withheld from others. Years have passed since Nandini's body was pulled from that well in Kilmalagai. But for her family, time has not moved on. Justice, If it came at all, came incomplete. Will they eventually get justice in full? Time will tell. If this story moved you, disturbed you, or opened your eyes, subscribe to our channel for more real-life crime documentaries and fictional stories inspired by true events. We uncover the darkest corners of human nature, so you can be more aware, more informed, and maybe even safer.